Hi, I'm Roy Collin, and welcome to the show. I've got six podcasts, as you'll see behind me. A speaking podcast where I'm talking to speakers, coaches, authors, and even marketers. I've got the meditation podcast where I'm talking about meditation, breath work, yoga, chakras. I've got a load of meditations from 1 minute to 2 hours. I've got the Learn Polish podcast, and the episodes are about 5 to 10 minutes, and we deal with everyday topics like going to the dentist and things like that. The Awakening podcast is where I'm exposing fraud and corruption, but with solutions. And I've had guests like Mickey Willis, Dr. Peter McCullough, David Icke, and Thomas Rentz. The Crypto Podcast is where I'm exposing fraud and corruption in the crypto blockchain technology. So, about cryptos and NFTs, but also on the good things and how to invest safely. And finally, the Podfather, which you see there on my t-shirt, thepodfather.me, is where I'm helping podcasters either to start a podcast or existing podcasters how to grow their audience. And most of the episodes are short, but they're good tips that will help you improve your show. I also have a store on all of my podcasts, so you can go in. There's some of my products and also some of the affiliates that I do, and that helps me with the show. You'll find everything on bio.link/podcaster. And I'm also helping people start a podcast as well as doing a podcast tour. So you'll find everything on the link there. I'd like to thank my sponsor, danielpacker.com. He's helping people with fear, doubt, and anxiety. He's got a 90% success rate, and you only pay if he helps you. So be sure to check him out, danielpackard.com. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Be sure to comment on the social media and let us know what you think. You don't always have to agree, but as long as it's not abusive, the comment will stay up. Welcome to the Awakening Podcast. You can find all our episodes on awakeningpodcast.org. My guest today, I've actually been following him for years. I remember him being on the television, I believe, Rip Off Republic. He's a financial advisor, but he's author of a few books. And I'm actually happy to see that he was putting a lot of the profits from his books towards the Jack and Jill Foundation. And what happened is recently, my aunt sent my mother a recording of a video that you did in my beautiful city of Cork. And it was like breaking the silence event. So please welcome Eddie Hobbs.
Thank you very much, Roy.
It was what I love actually is you started off your presentation saying some of this is factual, I've the proof, and others are my opinion. And I think that was very important because a lot of the time today, there's people saying stuff and they're just creating havoc in the household because you either believe it or you don't. And I think the way you done it, as well as bringing your humor, because there's doom and gloom. I've seen people in the podcast, and I'm exposing this for 4 years, and there's a lot of people throwing the towel because there's no humor. They're just looking and they go down a dark place because it is dark if you look at it. But I think we need the humor. And I suppose, how did you manage to fill a room when, like, usually people are kind of blocking someone exposing all the corruption?
Well, I think probably it goes back to when I did Rip Off Republic back in 05. There were 4 1-hour programs in front of a live audience in the Helix in Dublin, and that got the highest audience for factual entertainment on the state broadcaster RTE in Irish history. It hasn't been matched since, and the reason that happened was because it really got up the government's nose, because I exposed all of the protectionism that was going on in the economy and showed how Ireland was effectively eating its young. The whole development land stuff and the banks and all of that. But I got into the professions as well, and I did it kind of with a sense of humor, and so you're right about humor, because humor is a great weapon. It's not that you use it as a weapon, but I mean, we used to in ancient Celtic culture, we had we had the bards, and the bards were the most powerful profession in Celtic society. You didn't want to get on the wrong side of the bards, because humor was used. The bards would write poetry about local kings and stuff. The bards could make or break people's reputations. Because if the audience is fearful of you and you're tyrannical, and it then turns to start to laugh at you, you're finished. It's a bit like the moment when the curtain is revealed in The Wizard of Oz, and there's just this little fat fleck in the corner behind it all, and it's gone. It's all over. The illusion is broken. And we've been through an illusion for three years, which is based on, military grade propaganda, highly organized, highly orchestrated, and people were hugely affected by it. So when we did get into the room in Cork and we filled it out, it was just under 1,000 people turned up, and there was 100 cars turned away. They came from all over the country. What I found in the room, Roy, was extraordinary level of energy, and the energy was actually emotion. And I was getting emotional because I was picking it up from the audience. And the reason it was emotional was because, and I only processed it later when I was talking to a behavioral psychologist who was there. She's actually one of the team that actually helped stage the event. And it was akin to talking to somebody for the first time who would come forward as a survivor of abuse. It was that kind of emotion. People have been abused by what's gone on. They know it. They mightn't know it in the detail you might or I might, but they know it. They feel it because it's happened to them. It's happened to their families, their friends, their loved ones. But they haven't been allowed to talk about it because the mainstream media do not cover it quite deliberately. And Ireland is really buttoned down in that regard. And the political establishment absolutely don't want to go near it because they've all been on the wrong side. And that's a huge issue. So you have unresolved trauma, and it's been swept under the carpet. And we've done that before in Ireland, and we all know where that leads to. With the clerical abuse, and you can't do that. You have to turn and face the trauma, because if you don't, it's going to damage you, and I mean you as a society. And I think that's the one thing that I walked away from the meeting with, that there's a complete volcano here of unresolved trauma, and it's not just in this room; it's national. And that I think is one of the big things I got out of it. Outside of all the facts, all of the data, all the counter narrative, all of that, just on a basic human level, we haven't dealt with this properly at all. If it is the case, as I believe it is, as I believe the facts support it, that we've been the subject to pretty advanced, highly organized global military-grade propaganda campaign all around this thing. And we locked ourselves away. We put on the symbols. We did the 2 meters, distance, which was nonsense anyway. We went around wearing masks. We jabbed ourselves, 5.5 billion of us globally, with emergency use authorized drugs that were rushed out. One of them was taken off the market during the week, AstraZeneca, because it's causing clots. And I think there'll be more of that. We now see the data. There's excess deaths everywhere on the planet. So there's a huge number of people have been clearly linked to the release of the vaccine, have been actually killed by the vaccine. I mean, that's the conclusion, and there's no other conclusion you can reach. No, science has to prove it, absolutely, but it's pretty bloody obvious that it's the vaccines that have done it. And one of the most recent pieces of information from Dowd, there, one of the analysts that covers this stuff, he's based in Hawaii now. He's a former hedge fund manager from Wall Street, that has done a lot of deep dive data on it. And he's saying, and he's correct, that when you look at the cohort, that the cohort that were killed initially would have been the very elderly. That's understandable for obvious reasons we don't have to get into. But actually, the next level down, then, where there's been a lot of excess deaths, of course, as you know, is the death rate over and above the normal death rate, is in the age group 30, kind of 25 to 40, and 45, that kind of band. And it shouldn't be happening there, and yet it happened there. And the number in America, based on just what their own national data is showing, the excess death rate looks like 60,000. I mean, that's greater than the number of young people that were killed in the Vietnam War, American young people. That's the level we're talking about. I mean, it's so big, it's so vast. It's so big, and that cognitive dissonance fills in. People say I can't deal with that. They literally put their hands over their ears and shake their heads, as I was saying in my talk. They can't cope with it, and yet that's what it is. And once you get past that, and it's very difficult to do that. I totally accept that. It's very difficult to turn and face this thing on an individual level. And in split families, it will, of course, for the moment, but the data will overwhelm the resistance, and everybody will have to turn and face it, and accept that they themselves were, like I was, taken in by it, and that the actual leaders they thought were the good leaders around them in their society were actually weren't, and that there is an attempt to try and snap into place a global technocratic administration, taking on vast powers, and that's what's happening at the moment as we speak with the World Health Organization. Its attempts are to do that. That's quite clear from the documentation. It's why 49 US senators have revolted on it over the last couple of weeks, actually, since the 1st of May. It's why the UK is saying, sorry, there's a sovereignty problem here. We don't like what we see. And, the Netherlands have also, put a rocket across the bows of the WHO. So it's all now beginning to unravel at the edges. And the problem that creates then is that if this is what it appears to be, which is an attempt to try and snap this thing into place, a bit like if you have ever studied Macbeth, the Rivers of Blood speech, it's easier to go forward than to retreat, to double down. And that would be my concern, that they've now no choice but to try and double down, to try it all over again. It mightn't be a pandemic, it may be some other aspect of creating absolute panic and fear and anxiety throughout the world. And then people will then be prepared to give up their freedoms give up their freedoms in order to get more feel more safety. And of course, that's the classic playbook out of the totalitarian playbook, And we know this because it's been very well studied, especially by Hannah Arendt, who I talked about, great woman from the last century. And she said in 1951 that this was 10 years before she was covering the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1951. She said that the totalitarianism of the 21st century will be headed by banal, faceless bureaucrats. That's what she said in the middle of the last century.
It's, like you were talking about in America, the amount of people that died. I've had a guest, his daughter was Down syndrome, and basically she was murdered. Remdesivir, and there's I forget the name of the one in the UK. So they were intentionally murdering people. I personally know people in a few of the countries, they know that they died from the poison that, but he's trying to take a landmark case that's going through at the moment, and like showing how all the doctors were liable. And that's across the board. Whereas, it was a case of they weren't allowing people to go into the hospital, and they were just kind of like trust the doctors. Unfortunately, the amount of money he was showing, like some people were saying, oh, it's like 4,000 for this, 6,000. He was showing it's like over $250,000 was the actual financial reward for when there was debt involved, which is sickening. And I mean, it's everything is connected to the money, which you've even covered that on your stuff. If I go back to kind of the event, I think why there was such a connection is because usually in America now, there's everybody is on the left or the right, and they're convinced that person is going to save them. In the last 10 years, we kind of saw the left and the right, Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil coming together with the Green Party. But the sad thing is, some people then thought maybe the people's before profit would have been good, and then they started pushing the transgender and NAFTA. And there's just so many things that we're doing. But with the referendum, it was like every political party was telling the Irish people vote yes. And once people dug down, realized this isn't good for us. So I think the reason they were connecting with you is people have lost hope with there's nobody you can vote for because they're all for this agenda instead of for the people.
Well, firstly, there's let me just unpack some of the points there, because you've raised quite a few very, very critical issues. The first thing is that when you stand back and look at all of this horizontally, it's hard to do it. And I've said that this is hard to do if you're doing it for the first time. So that's accepted. Once you stand back and look at it horizontally and apply, critical thinking to what's going on, and you follow and read the research and you make sure that it stacks up, you will begin to see it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. And what you begin to see here is a complete, well, what Professor David Hughes, I interviewed him just yesterday, would call an omniwar. And he's a professor of international relations, and he's a professor in Lincoln University in the UK, just wrote out a book called The War for Technocracy. He's absolutely right. It is an omniwar. It's happening at various levels. So let's just unpack them. Firstly, Most countries in the world are being pressurized into bringing in hate speech law, including Ireland. They haven't signed it into law yet because they're very nervous because there's a kickback from the Irish. Especially after the vote of the 8th of March, which I'll come to in a second. So hate speech is everywhere. Hate speech law. The objective of hate speech law is to send a chill through public discourse. It's to stop us talking to one another. It's this, in other words, you can then snitch on somebody who said a few words that you regard as potentially, because you're woke, potentially negative towards certain named minorities. And then you go down to the local police station and you can fill in a report card on them. And then the Gardaí can call out to your house and walk straight in with a bench warrant, of course, and they can take your mobile phone and your laptop and those of your children and all members of your family, and they can look for any content that could be deemed to be hateful towards a named minority, and you can be prosecuted, and that then will go before the courts. Now, the purpose of that's not required to deal with the issues we've got at all. We have plenty of legislation, and we have plenty of conduct amongst us as protocols in society anyway. So where did they come from? Well, nobody knows. It just kind of arrived like a mothership from outer space through the political system in Ireland. Nobody wants to take ownership of it now, and but it looks as if it was an NGO. And where do the NGOs get their ideas and their money from? I mean, that's the key question, because that's what's been happening. This is all linked to what calls stakeholder capitalism, which Klaus Schwab peddles, and that's the whole idea that you hollow out representative democracy, because that's the problem, and you influence it while you're hollowing it out using NGOs. You pour money through them. You do the same thing with the unions. You can make them captive as well by putting activists in there, people that have been programmed or brainwashed into thinking that this is good for the humanity and the planet, which of course it isn't. So that's the hate speech stuff. Then there was an attempt in Ireland to change the very definition of family in a referendum that nobody wanted. And I said, where did that come from? How are we having a vote to change the definition of marriage to enduring relationships at a time when the country is being flooded with asylum seekers? So suddenly you're in an enduring relationship. I mean, it's very easy to join the dots there. So the enduring relationship was roundly rejected by the Irish people, and you're absolutely right. The entire political system, with very few exceptions, and the entire media establishment, with no exceptions, were all saying, "Oh, vote yes," virtue signaling, vote yes, and there was no question about it. This was just going to go through. And then the mood changed. The pitchforks were taken out of the hay because the Irish people smelt a rat, and they were right. And then they were led in that regard as well. They listened to some very good briefings by former Minister for Justice, Senior Barrister Michael McDowell, and another very good senior barrister now standing for a European seat in Munster, Una McGurk. They connected. People said, right, I knew I smelt a rat, and these people have just given me the photograph of the rat. And so they turned up in large numbers and rejected those two constitutional amendments by an absolutely crushing majority. And the media were in absolute shock. And their response was, well, they didn't understand. We didn't communicate it to them properly. In other words, we should go back and try it again. And the main opposition party, who built up their popularity on the basis of attacking the government's record, were suggesting, we just, what? We'll change the wording. We'll go back and get a yes vote. They said that in advance of the vote. Of course, they're not saying it now. And so that was a major thing, right? So why was that going on? And then when you look at the UN documentation on child sex education, volume of stuff. I mean, that's now pouring through the actual education system in our country, where young children are being exposed to pretty sinister. I would regard it as sinister. And by the way, I'm not conservative.
And just
I'm
on
not
that,
conservative.
Ivor Cummins done a lovely video on
Yeah,
that, exposing the actual documentation they're using to teach the
shocking.
teachers.
Yeah, it's shocking. I mean, you could use the term satanic, and you wouldn't be exaggerating it, because they're actually suggesting that a child that turns up in a primary school wanting to identify as something or another needs to be that everybody in the class needs to take part in the pantomime and support them. And if you don't, you're a bold boy or a bold girl. I mean, this is nut stuff, right? And that's going on. That's literally going on as we speak. So the gender confusion, let's call it that, is all part of it. And you might say, well, what's the connection here? And the answer is that when you study totalitarianism and you get your head away from the idea that this is behind us in the rearview mirror, when you study people like Hannah Arendt and you study people like Matthias Desmet, the professor of psychology at the University of Ghent, and many others, because they'll quote many other sources as well. They're all connected, saying the same thing. When you study totalitarianism, this is straight from the playbook. What you cannot build a kind of a technocratic administration that everybody venerates and does what they're told, unless you can implement very close surveillance and control of societies, hence digital IDs and central bank digital currency and personal carbon limits will all go into your digital record. And once that happens, it's game over. That would snap it all into place, because now you can't spend your money as you deem fit. It's being monitored. You will have limits to what you can spend, your carbon credit. You will have limits to the food that you can buy, because we're trying to save. We have this bizarre notion that we can save the planet by reducing human CO2 emissions from catastrophe. I mean, it's utter nonsense. It's the same model, creating panic and fear in order to drive the agenda. And COVID, the COVID pandemic was a runway to land a very substantial part of that entire plan, which was the WHO technocracy, which would mean that unelected people in Geneva would be able to dictate to the rest of us on human health, animal health, plant health, and ecosystems. I mean, that's the entire planet, and declare emergencies, as well as pandemic health emergencies of international concern, fakes, unilaterally, notwithstanding anything they'll say to the contrary. That's its intent. And so what you're seeing here then is basically creating chaos in society, creating division in society, changing the very definition of family, loosening the bonds there, creating a surveillance and snitch system where we all will monitor one another and report into the center. And then you have a kind of social credit surveillance system, a Chinese type of system, and we all come under it, because when you look at stakeholder capitalism sits between capitalism and communism, and it's a mixture of both. That's what it is, but it's closer to the Chinese model than it is to the way we live our lives at the moment. And the people who benefit from that then are those that sit atop the technocracy. And they have the wealth of Croesus, and the rest of us are literally battery hens. That's the plan. I mean, it sounds bizarre. I mean, if I said at the speech that if I said this thing if somebody played this tape back to me 3.5 years ago, I would have said to myself, geez, Eddie, you need to go into hospital. I just wouldn't have accepted it. I said, this is, you're unwell, check yourself in. But it's true. That's the unfortunate thing. All the facts are there to support it. I mean, it's there in front of us. All you have to do is just open your eyes. You see the hate speech bills, you see the WHO agreement, you see the central bank digital currency coming in and the digital IDs. You know that the UN IPCC zealots want to convince us that we should all have personal carbon limits, and that if if you're wealthy, you can actually buy the carbon limits off the poor, and so that you can fly around the world. It's all just in front of us. But the thing is that the big lie is being sold. Let me just explain that. The small lie, we're all used to small lies. We tell them ourselves. But the big lie is something that our brains can't get around. We find it phenomenal. Like, how could you get away with a big lie in open sight? Well, it was being written about nearly 100 years ago when a pretty well-known character there in Central Europe decided to write a book while he was in jail, and it's called Mein Kampf, and it's straight out of his book. It's been repeated ever since by Hannah Arendt, for example, when she was studying all of that. The big lie is how you do it, and the big lie is that this is all just accidental. This is just, sure, look, listen, there was a bit of an old scare around the virus, and they all got it wrong, and we all got into a panic. We did, look, nonsense. For example, 4 months after the pandemic broke upon us and Italy went into lockdown, in July 2020, the UK Office for National Statistics, the government actuarial department, it's the units involved in overseeing the health system concluded in a report that's there that the actual impact of lockdown on our lifestyle and our health was worse than the threat of the disease itself. That, in other words, they were now 4 months into it, and they could see this wasn't a pandemic. This was dangerous for elderly people, and it was going to cause problems, but it wasn't a pandemic. And why do we know that? Because in 2009, the WHO changed the definition of a pandemic, and they did it like out of an episode of Yes Minister, when the Department for Administration was told you need to call like 30 or 40,000 jobs. So what they did was they just changed the definition of employment in certain sections, and they created the appearance of 40,000 jobs off the list just by a bureaucratic switcheroo. And this is what happened in 2009. The definition of pandemic was changed from something that had a high level of fatality and was a high level of sickness such that you had to close down factories because people couldn't get out of bed, they were so sick. That was all removed. And it just became about the infectability rate, even though it could have been a very mild virus, which is what we actually had. So by July 2020, the authorities in the UK were saying this to themselves. So why then did lockdown continue on for another year? And Ireland ran the longest lockdown in Europe. If they knew the data was telling them the story that we now know to be true, that this wasn't a pandemic in the conventional sense of the word. They just changed the definition. And then, of course, when it became apparent that the so-called vaccines were not stopping transmission, which we were told was what they were going to do, all the way from Joe Biden down, we're no one's safe until we're all safe. It was all propaganda. They then changed the definition of a vaccine itself. So vaccines, the definition changed. They changed, switcheroo in the middle of the whole thing. And like all of these facts are there. I mean, when Pfizer got its emergency use authorization for its vaccine in the United States in I think it was October, November 2021, the same day, the FDA, the regulator, launched a campaign attacking ivermectin as a horse dewormer. A cheap and cheerful drug that could be used in certain cases to eliminate COVID, which was used by in Uttar Pradesh in northern India for 263 million people. That and vitamin D, because they weren't going to spend money on these vaccine products that were being flogged to them from the West, and they had no problems.
I
Why is
remember
it that
Joe Rogan was talking about that, and CNN put a picture of him out yellow, like he was sick, and saying that he was taking horse medicine. So that was the propaganda that they were
it
pushing.
was, yeah, but Roy, like the propaganda was coming from the actual regulators. Now, the WHO today is saying that as part of this new pandemic agreement, their changes to the regulations, they're setting themselves up as a regulator, that no prophylactic or vaccine will be certified unless it's certified by them. So now they're the regulator. So, and they're funded almost like over 80% of their philanthropic funding is from Gates. About €1.05 of their entire funding comes from the Gates Foundation. Now, Gates is very interesting. In September 2019 is a very interesting month. That's when the Chinese government, the military, raided the Wuhan lab, September 2019. September 2019 was when the Republican committee investigating what went on reckoned that this novel virus first erupted. September 2019 was when Bill Gates, through the Gates Foundation, put 53 million into BioNTech for its just before it went IPO, before it went public, and that was the partner to Pfizer. And then about 6 weeks later, there is the event in New York, the 2001 event, sponsored by Bill Gates and the WEF, the World Economic Forum. They were the sponsors. And they were gaming the breakout of a coronavirus globally that will kill 60 million. And you know, there would have to be lockdowns and all this kind of stuff. That was part of the gaming. Then the next thing, the second in command of the Wuhan Institute of Virology gets sick and goes into hospital. This is Ben Hu. He's Xi Zhengli's second in command. Then the Chinese said, yeah, there seems to be a bit of a novel coronavirus here, and I think we have a problem. And then they released the sequence of it, and then suddenly the PCR tests come in within 11 days of that. 11 days. And the PCR test magnification was set at levels, as I said, to find the bubonic plague in your system. Just keep magnifying some tiny particle, magnifying, magnifying, magnifying. And of course, it doesn't mean that you have coronavirus at all. It means that you may have a trace of something that could look like it, and that you're not shedding. So you're not actually infected. There's no infection, you know. So therefore, there's no risk. And this was used. I mean, that created a phantom pandemic. We were all watching phantom data. Every evening then in Ireland at 7 p.m. we were forced to sit down and watch the latest Hammer horror picture movie, you know, at the very end of that. The vampires always appear at the graveyard, the smoke comes out, and then the vampire turns up. And of course, there's the two reporters coming out from the latest briefing from the health authority, scared and then scaring the nation. We were all then suffering from free-floating anxiety. We didn't know what was going on. I mean, if you think about it, most of us dealt with the lockdowns by just blanking them out of our heads. It's almost as if we don't even have a memory of it, you know. And that's classic trauma, reaction to trauma. And so it goes on. And Gates then, by the way, back to Gates. Gates then sells his shares 2 years later for $1,300 million. Remember, he put in $55 million. That's 13 and a half times return on his money. And the same month that he sold those shares, he admitted to the fact that, oh, sorry, the vaccine, yes, it doesn't actually stop transmission at all. Sorry about that. We'll do better the next time. I mean, wake up, like, and see this for what it is. And the attack then on ivermectin was from, as I said, was from the regulator, but wasn't the only one. There was a scurrilous paper put around about hydroxychloroquine very early in the pandemic that was subsequently withdrawn. But it was only withdrawn after it had done the damage in the media. The media was completely compromised. The same day, the same words have been used by competing media organizations, you know, criticizing anybody, criticizing things like ivermectin and other things. And it was quite clear that the media themselves had been compromised. And you would say, well, who would have the power to do all that? The power to actually influence the way Google and Facebook and YouTube and TikTok and all of those were actually running their algorithms to suppress dissenting science. Forget the opinions, the scientists, to suppress them. How did that happen? How was it that regulators of medical regulators went after doctors that were actually doing their job under their Hippocratic oath? They believed in informed consent. How was it that in Ireland, for example, there's 19,000 registered under the medical council? There's only a handful of them stood up. Everybody else just kept their head down and went along with it. You can't understand all of that unless you are deeply studied and professional about how totalitarianism regimes come into effect, because it's straight out of the playbook. And that playbook can only that wasn't done by an accidental collaboration of pharmaceutical companies coming together for the sake of just making squillions. I mean, it's much deeper than that. That's the problem. I believe for a while in the happenstance theory as well, that this just happened and it was just a coordination of vested interests got together and drove it in a certain direction. No, this was highly organized, and there's too much power here, and it completely fits into kind of professional military level planning. There is no other explanation for it. And that's what happened. It would then mean that's why I started my talk in Cork with Eisenhower's warning in 1960, as he was stepping down from president, 1959 of 1960, about the deep state. He warned about it then. And a few years later, of course, Kennedy was shot. And when he was shot, they set up the Warren Commission. And at the same time, the Warren Commission, which said, oh, there was only just one shooter in Dallas, fair enough, that's what the Warren Commission said. But the CIA issued a protocol, which I name in the talk, where they turned critical thinker into conspiracy theorists. That's where the term conspiracy theorist came from, to attack and denigrate and diminish, including using proxies, any person that suggested that the Warren Commission was wrong. Came up with alternative opinions or facts around the event. That's where it came from. So these psychological operations have been running for a long time, and they were just done on a global scale. And it was so vast and so big that for many of us, and I'm saying this, I struggled to accept this, but the evidence is just overwhelming at this stage, and more of it is coming out. And that's where we find ourselves. So you might say, well, what's the positivity here? What's the hope? And the answer is, it's a bit like the Wizard of Oz. I know I'm simplifying it, but it actually is quite simple. And that's where we're at the moment where we have to pull down the curtain and see the little fat feck in the corner, working the machine, because that's what's behind all this. It's a small number of people, obviously supported by vast wealth, engaged in trying to implement something that is completely offensive to the rest of humanity, and that's what they're doing. And the way you stop them is by pulling down the curtain and saying, "Look at them." And then the fastest way, then the best weapon you can use against them. Yes, they'll be this is going to go on for a long time. There'll be criminal prosecutions, no doubt, and at some stage along the way. But what we can do as ordinary human beings is we can laugh at them, because they can't bear it. That's what we have to do.
I think the problem as well is people are attacking each other. And I have seen people just stop, trying to expose all this because they can't, you're always going to be attacked, but you have to kind of get thick skin as well for when you're fighting that. Like you touched on a few things there. I mean, when we look at China, we were looking at the people just falling on the street, dropping dead kind of thing. It's like that. That was all a lie. What I had found out is the PCRs were bought in the millions in 2017 and 2018. So that showed they know exactly what they were doing. When I started looking at we had to start saying the poison dart, because with censorship, not only did a lot of my guests, their websites get removed and everything, I got kicked off YouTube, I got kicked off Linktree, I got so much censorship. Facebook removes of thumbs and comments and everything. Like there was nothing getting out there, so I had to kind of get creative with my marketing. And like when I started looking at the injection, I started reading a lot of books, getting a lot of guests on, and I started realizing that we have been conditioned to think that a vaccine actually works. And like when we were young, we probably have the little jab on our thing for polio. That was actually from spraying DDT, a crop, the poisons on that, and they created the vaccine from that. And if you go back even further, Edward Jenner, it was like horse and cowpox, and they said take out people like horses. So I got Dr. Peter McCullough. We done a live show with him. We were talking.
All right.
I don't think any vaccine has worked, and I've got some medical people confirm that. I started saying then about animals, because I think that they started chipping the animals. That was when we were young. That wasn't happening. Tagging them, injecting them all the time. My brother's dog died from a vaccine, and I saw it happening a few times. And as I'm talking to Dr. Peter McCullough about that, he says, come to think of it, my dog has been sick since we got it vaccinated. So I think that they've been conditioning us, starting with the animals and then the humans. But when you actually start, like Tom Cohn is a very good guy, he's exposed all this. He's basically like, he was looking after the kids. And it was like the kids that weren't vaccinated were never sick. It was the ones that were getting asthma, eczema, all these other different things. So it's like this, unfortunately, like, and even if you look at autism, the increase, it's like something like 1 in 22 in boys in America now, and 1 in 34, where it was 1 in 100,000 before. And it's all in correlation with the increase in jabs that people have got.
Yeah.
And I think people have to be conscious of that, because we have, like, in Ireland, like, no, we've lost faith in the medical industry. Like, people now are afraid to go into hospital because the chances of you actually dying in hospital are kind of higher than if you stay at home, which is a sad state of affairs. And that seems to be the norm now across a pond.
Well, I agree. I mean, well, firstly, we like a major champion of what you've just said, of course, is Robert F. Kennedy and his two tomes, really, which are prosecutions at a level of prosecution evidence against the people behind this. And he makes one said, no, he's accused, oh, you're anti-vaxxer. And he said, I'm not anti-vaxxer. I'm pro-safe vaccines. It's a very, very important point. I mean, when the Reagan administration bowed under pressure from the pharmaceutical industry back in the 80s, and then allowed, indemnities for the pharmaceutical industry um, against claims for vaccine harm, it went gangbusters because now if you could get on the mandated vaccine list, you didn't have to spend any money in sales and marketing, and the government would do the work for you, which is exactly the public-private partnership that the WHO now wants to set up, because it's asking national governments to set up, labs like the Wuhan Institute of Virology, put PCR tests into human waste, into our waste system, find new pathogens, bring them into your labs, and gain of function is allowed, enhance the pathogen, and come up with, and then get together with the pharmaceutical industry and come up with a vaccine. And of course, if one of those yolks escapes accidentally, you make a fortune. I mean, this is fascism, which is a kind of totalitarianism. It's just communism is the other type. They're just the same thing, just two different sets of thugs behind it. I mean, that's the plan. Now, what Kennedy has said throughout his discussions, his interviews, and his books, highly documented, and he's absolutely right. Yeah, we have vaccines. I've been vaccinated. You've been vaccinated. And the vaccine may be effective against the thing that it's being targeted against. But there is no studies which show what damage is the vaccine doing to the human immune system. What other side effects? What are the long-term effects of this? And he's absolutely right. There isn't any studies. In fact, he attended a meeting with Fauci, and Fauci said, "Oh, there are studies," and Kennedy challenged him, "Well, produce them," and he hasn't heard from him since. So because there aren't any studies, so what we're looking at here is it's causal. Yes, you can clearly see the vaccines coming in. For example, let's just deal with the COVID ones, brought in, Operation Warp Speed kind of stuff, lashed out into the market. Everything is fine. Take them. Nobody's safe until we're all safe. And presidents taking jabs in their arms, and it won't go beyond the injection site. And trust us, trust the science. Down with the anti-vaxxers and all of that. There's all an entire propaganda war. That's all. That's what happened. They now want to do this all over again, watch, rinse, and repeat, and go from lab to jab in under 100 days. And they expect us just to do it because they think we scared them so much now. We've broken their morale. They're divided and arguing with one another over asylum seekers and over one thing or another that we're also creating. So we have them where we want them now, panicked and divided, and let's just finish the job. That's where they are, the people behind this. Where we are is we're waking up saying, hold on a second here now, let's just march into the palace at Oz and pull down the bloody curtain and let everybody see. All the little munchkins see Oz for what he actually is, a little fat feck in the corner. I keep saying it because it's the best analogy I could use to say that's the power we've got. Exposure, more, get more and more information to people to wake them up. And the ideal way of doing that is humor, questions, and once the comedians start doing that, that will be a huge help. But I think we're at that pivot point because what we're seeing now in the Senate in the US and the UK government coming out and so on, that there is a whole on a second here moment going on, and more information is now leaking out. And the problem is that your local politicians, your local media, I mean local as a national, are completely and utterly set up to try and continue the attack on anybody that raises questions and think they can get away with it because they are culpable. And they're going to have to pay a price, especially at the very top, for what they've done, for what they've inflicted on their own people. And the people that will make them pay the price will be the people themselves, once more and more and more people wake up to what's going on. I mean, that's my assessment of it. On the question of the vaccines themselves, are they good or are they bad? Well, I mean, one of the things that's quite clear is that there's two types of science. There's pure science, where people are coming out, bringing out their science, bringing out blunt information, whether it's about climate change, like Dr. Judith Curry, who I interviewed on climate change, or Professor David Hughes, whose book is just coming out. These are all dedicated, pure scientists. Then there's the checkbook scientists. And the checkbook scientists are everywhere. They're the people that are getting the money to support whatever the narrative is. So the whole UNIPCC is infected with it. The whole grant system. It's the exact same system, completely the same system when it comes to vaccines. The grants coming through from the regulator down through to the academics and the institutions. They're getting money to do this. And then when it broke, then I can tell you that nearly every GP in Ireland, with very few exceptions, was getting a massive increase in revenue to jab you in the arm, putting stuff into your arm that they had no clue about. There was no informed consent because nobody knew what was going in. And even today, now the studies that are being done globally into what has gone into some of these vaccines are raising very substantial questions, very, very, very serious questions about what's in some of these vaccines. There are things in them that think there's findings in them of things that should not be there at all, that they just never seen before. There's suggestions that these contain some of these contain nanotechnology. That's the suggestion in these studies. All that has to wash out, whether they do or they don't. And I'm not saying they do or they don't, because I have to wait for it to happen. It's quite clear that none of this should have ever happened. There shouldn't have been a pandemic because the definition, it didn't pass the real definition of one. We were all panicked into falling into line, and not realizing. We look back in history and we thought, well, that's the Germans for you. Sure, they just follow orders, and they would be very open to that. We tend not to look at what happened in Soviet Russia because we don't know enough about it. But all you have to do is study the books of Hannah Arendt. It's all there in black and white. Not realizing that despite despite whatever you think about your intellectual prowess or how many degrees you have, you're just as prone to everybody else to be manipulated by psychological operations. You just are. So we kind of murmurate like starlings as humanity. And unless you're aware of that, it's very easy to fall for it. And lots of people did. And now they can't admit it to themselves. That's a real problem. And but what I found in my little kind of journey through this is that the actual working class person, the fella that turns up, to cut the grass or, do the plumbing, get into a chat with them, they got it straight away. The people that are there literally at the grassroots of Irish society could see through it. Sure, of course it's nonsense, and they know more about it. But the academics, the so-called thought leaders of society, completely on the other side. Completely on the other side. Whether they're economic professors or professors of medicine, where were they? Where were they? I mean, there was nobody spoke up. They all kept their heads down. They were a disgrace to their profession, a disgrace, and they need to be called out for their participation in it. Now that's not just about retribution. That's about making sure that, and I think that's the second part of what you were saying, is that we have to have a clean out. We have to have a clean out of the political system. We have to have a clean out of the leadership of the health system. We have to have a clean out of the World Health Organization, or we need to exit it. And we have to have a clean out as well of senior politicians in the European Union, or else we exit it. Because we cannot have an open border situation where the actual basic fabric of society itself is being transformed by a flood of people coming into the country. This is nothing, and people say, oh, that's racism, it's the usual tropes will apply. But like we are a very open people, and we brought in huge numbers of people into our country with an open heart. And we've been doing that for a long time. So Ireland has become quite diverse in that regard. So that's not the issue at all. The issue is the excess flooding of asylum seekers coming in, young men of military age, because that's the truth of it. And you begin to wonder, well, why is that happening? And what's the thought behind that? And why can't we control that? And if we can't control it, why are the national politicians not discussing this openly with the people, coming up with solutions? Why is it that instead they're resorting to tropes? And then anybody who raises any questions or wants to talk about it, I mean, how you get to collective wisdom is by this kind of stuff: open public debate, discussion, chats where your views, your opinions can be challenged by somebody else, and then you may change your position as a consequence. That's how we generate collective wisdom. But when we're not talking to one another because of hate speech law, when we're not engaged in discussing this because the media won't cover it, and when our political leaders themselves are resorting to labeling their own people, anybody who raises a question, as far right, and then that's echoing through the media: far right, far right, far right. Listen, that's propaganda. That's a propaganda war. That has nothing to do with debate or collective wisdom. It's straightforward psychological operations being enacted by us, by our own political class. That's what's going on. And there is a class war now breaking out, I believe, between the rest of us and the people at the very, very top of this pyramid of power that goes right up through the European Union, right up through the WHO and the UN and beyond, into the Bank for International Settlements, the central banks underneath that, and beyond. That's the power pyramid, and we need, that's where Oz is, and we need to go and bang on the door.
With, I mean, we heard of all the cases of the COVID, but the thing is, most people don't realize is the flu went on vacation, because there was always, you're going to have like 36 million, but there was always a percentage of deaths from flu just when people were getting old and everything.
Yeah.
And it disappeared. So that straight away is kind of showing you the lie. I know you touched on it, and I want to go into this because Klaus Schwab, I call him Anal Schwab, his lovely book, which the strange thing about it is this was written in it was published in 2020. I'm not sure the exact, I don't know, was it in June or something like that? So like as an author, how long it takes to write a book, get everything approved and everything published and everything. That's not something that you do in a week.
No, it takes a year.
Exactly, take a year, right? So there's a few things in this, right? He's like, it's published in the this is mentioned in the book now, published in the midst of the crisis and when further waves of the infection are expected. That's on page 9, just for those that have the book or thinking of getting it. Another one: policymakers must be prepared to deal with at least another 18 to 24 months of significant COVID-19 activity. Page 42. So there's Klaus Schwab with his crystal ball. Like straight away you're like, oh, this isn't planned, right? And then they're talking about the most effective form of tracking mobile phones. This is obviously before it happened. So like they're telling you, that's the thing, they believe in karma. They tell you everything.
Yeah.
Like there's other stuff here, but I won't go into it. Like they're just talking
about. Klaus Schwab is very handy, Roy, because he actually, Schwab is a bit of an idiot. He's a bit of a distraction for me, but he has the benefit of giving the game away because he's a bit of an idiot and he's mouthy, and he if he was a chalk ice, he'd be licking himself, and so he loves the attention that it brings him and the power that he's generated. So let's just talk about Schwab for a second. So Rockefeller, back in the day, appointed Kissinger to get involved in promoting this agenda way back in the 50s. Kissinger then appointed Klaus Schwab to set up the World Economic Forum in the early 1970s. This was around the time that the Club of Rome that Rockefeller was involved in, and Kissinger was involved in on all of them, suggesting that the actual problem here is humanity itself, how to control it. And this idea of a one world administration has been knocking around for a long time. And they knew as far back as the 1950s that that you can snap something into place if you can scare people enough. And the two big scary things would be climate and pandemics. They knew it as far back as then. And then so Schwab has been building the World Economic Forum since the early 1970s. That's how long this is going on. He claims to have 2,500 members of the World Economic Forum, people that have been educated, gone through their training programs in various administrations throughout the world. And he's absolutely praiseworthy of Trudeau. He loves Trudeau. Trudeau's I won't say what I was going to say, but Trudeau to me is tyrannical, and I'm being mild in what I'm saying about him. What he did to the ordinary Canadian trucker. I get emotional when I think about it. What they did to those men and women just driving across Canada to Ottawa, raid their bank accounts, basically criminalize them.
And the donors' bank
Penalize.
accounts as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's appalling what the Canadians have allowed to happen on their watch from this fella. Ardern in New Zealand, zero COVID, zero COVID. Like the concept itself is absurd. She resigned. She got out of Dodge before all this started to unravel. She's another young leader group member. Varadkar, our fella, resigned recently after the Irish people put a run on him during the constitutional amendment. He was gone very shortly afterwards, and that is connected to it. He's another member of the young leaders group. So is Macron. And of course, on the board of trustees of the year before COVID is the current president of the European Commission. She's on the board of trustees. Al Gore is on the board of trustees. I mean, it's all there in open sight. People say, "Oh, it's a conspiracy theory." It's not. They're documents. They're talking about it. It's there. I mean, conspiracy is something that's hidden. It's not something that's published in front of you. It's just that you refuse to look at it because it's so big. You just can't absorb it. But you can absorb it. You just need the courage to do it. And once you do it, you can't unsee it. And then you can start informing your friends and family, about tearing down the curtain in Oz. So Schwab goes through all of that, and with the World Economic Forum. Now, the World Economic Forum then becomes a central play. There's a pivot point, and the pivot point, which I talk about in my talk, is in January 2020. And in January 2020, events are happening now in China. So there's engagement between the World Health Organization and the Chinese medical authorities, which is why Tedros Ghebreyesus, Uncle Teddy Tedros of the World Health Organization chief, a former communist from Ethiopia with no medical background and a very unusual CV, put it to you like that. He can't make it. So he appoints somebody to stand in for him. And the person he appoints is Sir Jeremy Farrar, the chief of the Wellcome Trust, the fourth largest foundation in the world. And Farrar, so Farrar is there in Davos, and the word comes through. As the date is beginning to come through, Davos is taking place in January 2020. Klaus Schwab is there, of course, as well. So there's a press conference, and it involves Sir Jeremy Farrar, and he's shoulder to shoulder with a guy called Richard Hatchett. Now, Richard Hatchett was appointed by Bill Gates as the chief executive officer of an organization called CP, the Coalition for Epidemic Innovations, Pandemic Innovations, I think it's called. Anyway, that's the organization. He's there. Now, what makes Hatchett interesting is that Hatchett, when he was in the Bush administration, 2005, 2006, released a paper which was completely contrary to all existing science about coronaviruses and suggested that in the event of a pandemic, that the military would lock down the United States of America. They would go into lockdown. And the scientists throughout the world the epidemiologists were horrified at this because they knew that you don't go into lockdowns. I mean, you create greater problems than you solve. And that was the WHO policy. So why wasn't it applied? So they have a press conference and they absolutely clamored for a lockdown. We must have a Chinese-style lockdown. So Farrar and Hatchett are together doing that. And where is Sir Jeremy Farrar now? For 6 marks, like. Jeremy Farrar is now the chief scientist appointed last year at the WHO. I mean, this is simple join the dot stuff. This is not complicated. And we shouldn't try to overcomplicate it. What we can then see is that in early February 2020, there's a phone call. We know this from emails, and this is all documented in the Robert F. Kennedy material. So there's a phone call hosted by Farrar, which involves Fauci and a few others, basically talking about how can we avoid the link between the gain of function going on at the Wuhan lab and this virus. And they decide we need to support the zoonotic origin hypothesis. They're putting it together. And then, this is the idea then that some bat flew across 1,000 kilometers across China, didn't land anywhere, didn't affect anybody, and just arrived into the Wuhan wet market and infected somebody. And, close enough to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That's just unfortunate. But it was the bat what done it. And then they then get 28 scientists to support a letter going into one of the main medical journals the next day or a few days later, basically completely dissing as a conspiracy theory the idea that this came out of the lab in Wuhan, and that it was basically a bat what done it. Now, when they published that, contrary to normal protocols in these so-called venerable medical journals, which were captive to the whole thing, you have to state if you have any conflicts of interest. Are you being paid? Are you on the drip from the NIAID, from the money going in for gain of function into all of these professional investigators on behalf of the pharmaceutical industry? And they were all, like 27 of the 28 of them were all in the drip. So this was a deliberate attempt to cover up. Now, what we also know is that work being done by Ralph Barrick, who was in the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. He got about 30 million in grants in 2012, 2013 for gain of function research, right? And he's about 15 or 20 patents. But anyway, one of them had to do with what was going. One of them was one of these grants, one of these patents was then handed to Shi Zhenli at the Wuhan lab and was being used basically to humanize mice, and then to try and cross the human-animal barrier with whatever way they were developing the pathogen, and that's what happened. And then Fauci, who gave the money to Barrick to do the gain of function research and of course patented it, then a number of months later, in a sworn inquiry in Washington, says, "Who, Ralph Barrick? Oh, I don't know that guy at all. I wouldn't recognize him if I passed him in the street." I mean, like, that was under oath. So this guy Fauci, who was 40 years involved in like, if you're a regulator of anything, whether it's banking or whether it's healthcare, you have to change the officership of the regulator maybe once every 5 or 7 years to avoid becoming captive to the very industry you're regulating, because that's how these things. There's so much money involved. It's how it works. Otherwise, you're looking for saints. And but Fauci was there for 40 years, and 20 years before all of this happened, in Fauci's own book, he talks about 20 years ago. He talks about being requested by Bill Gates to meet him in his house, his 40,000 square foot house in Seattle, and they go into the library, and it's a direct quote. And Bill said to me, "Let's become partners." Like, Christ Almighty, like, I mean, how much more facts and evidence do people need to see this for what it is? It was a setup. We were all set up. That's what happened. And we're now dealing with the aftermath of it, which is people, many people out there knowing something is wrong. They don't feel good about it, but they can't face some of this information. But unfortunately, they know people in their own family and in their wider friend that have been harmed by the vaccines, that harmed or killed. And that's not going to go away, and it may get worse before it gets better. That's the real outstanding question we can't deal with now. Meanwhile, the officer class in our political systems and the officer class in our health systems and all the other scientists that stayed quiet are completely and utterly compromised and need to be replaced. That's what needs to happen. We need a complete refresh of leadership right across the board, because the old leadership completely failed us. They either took part knowingly, or they were unwitting proxies for manipulation by the people behind all of this. And these are dramatic things to say. And as I said, it took me 3.5 years to get to a position where I was prepared to say it. I prepared to even think it and then say it and then do something about it, and deal with all of the flack that will subsequently come my way as a consequence of that. But somebody has to lead it in Ireland, because Ireland is like, may have recovered from clerical fascism, may have dealt with all of the clerical abuse and all the rest of it, but Ireland is still a very secretive society, where we're a very homogenous society, notwithstanding the changes going on with the asylum seekers coming into the country, and the way we do our business is we whisper it. We're uncomfortable with people blowing the whistle. Well, I'm blowing the bloody whistle, and I'll just have to deal with whatever comes my way as a consequence of that. I'm not the only one. I mean, we've had people here in Ireland, constantly, putting their heart and soul into trying to get people to see this for what it is. Ivor Cummins would be one of those people who carried a huge load on his shoulders over many years and had to deal with the most horrific defamation and attacking his character and his opinions, including from the very system behind all of this, attacking him, people funded to do it. The same thing happened to Tracy O'Mahony, barrister. She came under savage attack, and it hurt her, but she stood up. She stood up to it. Senior barrister Una McGurk, again another woman, that stepped forward and took it and stood up to it. And there's been doctors lost their license, like Dr. Jerry Waters, who's a GP in Kildare. Again, another fine human being. People that actually stood up for what they believed in, which is like informed consent, the Hippocratic Oath, like basic stuff, being rounded on and still being rounded on by their own medical council. It's all politics, nothing to do with science. It's just politics. People covering their ass. We have to defend those people. We have to clear out the people that are doing this to them.
With, like, I mean, you've been on the TV, so you'd obviously have a lot of context on that. What I saw is over the years, and even especially during the referendum, and Neil Prendeville, I think it's Red FM, he was kind of like, he's doing like the devil's advocate, but I mean, he's really getting the message across. I think he's helping a lot. Is there, like, from talking to different people in RTE or just other media, is there anyone that would love to come out and they're just afraid of losing their job, or is it they just toe the line?
Well, Neil Prendeville would be an exception. He runs a radio. Well, he's the anchor of a radio station in Cork City, and he's just, he's his own person, and he was the actual person that broke ranks and gave me an interview about the WHO in advance, 2 weeks in advance of that meeting we had in Cork on April 25th. He did that. And but I can tell you that in the run up to that, on 4 separate occasions, I was being told by publishers and broadcasters they would not talk about the WHO. It's verboten. You can't talk about it. And if you come on the program, by the way, you can't talk about it on the program either. I was told that as well by the way, about coming on to talk to Neil. And the minute I was told it, I said, well, I'm definitely going to talk about it now. And of course, he just ran with it. By the way, it wasn't his idea that I shouldn't talk about the WHO. We just ran with it, and he gave it a good listening. And yeah, he's very good that way, but he's the absolute exception. I can tell you, other radio stations wouldn't let me near a live mic for absolutely no chance. As regards to RTE, RTE is a dead organisation. It died in January, February, March 2020. There isn't a journalist left in the place, not one. They engaged in the propaganda, and they drove it hard without asking any questions. And then across the main publications in Ireland, all of the main broadsheet newspapers never raised any questions. When inflation started to take off because of all of the money printing, there wasn't one single economics professor issued any paper when public and said this is going to generate inflation, even though it was patently obvious it was going to be inflationary because it was qualitatively different from the money printing that we've gone through since the global financial crisis in 08. Qualitatively different. It was going directly from the central banks directly into the pockets of consumers through government agencies. That's what happened. And I was locked out so much. I got one article away, and that was it. I got locked out. It was shadow banning, and I ran 4 different radio campaigns on News Talk, the national radio station, warning people that this was going to create inflation. The following year, 2021, the inflation starts to come through quite dramatically. And then the central banks all said, well, it's transitory inflation. It's transitory. That was brought out by the Fed. It was immediately parroted by the ECB and parroted by the central banks underneath the ECB, including the Central Bank of Ireland. And I was looking at this saying, these people know this is going to create inflation. It's quite obvious. I mean, if a gobshite like me can figure it out, they know this is inflationary, but nobody is saying it. And there was lots of economic professors, absolutely, you can be pretty damn sure, oh, this is going to be inflationary, probably talking about themselves, but nobody was going to say anything about it. Nobody was going to put their name to a paper saying it. And you know why? Because they were cowered by the same forces that cowered the medical profession. They were terrified of going counter-narrative. That's the reason. It's not because they didn't know. They didn't have the personal courage to do it. And there's going to be consequences for that. You know, they're going to be called out for that. Now that it's clear that what was a you know, kind of a headwind is now turning into a tailwind as people are waking, more and more people are waking up and the data is coming through. So, you know, we're still grappling with inflation. I know I jumped into economics there, but the same thing's happening then on the medical side. Where are they now? Where are the voices of the medical establishment that were all pro-vaccine or, you know, keeping their heads down, even now with the data that's pouring through on excess deaths and the data that's pouring through on vaccine harm? Where are they? Where are our leaders, or your civic leaders, the politicians, and where are the medical leaders that are actually prepared to go to camera and say we have a huge problem? I mean, if you look at Japan, Professor Fukushima, the top oncologist in Japan, is saying in Japanese, I can't do Japanese, but he's basically saying we have a huge problem with turbo cancer, with people turning up with stage 4 cancer. That's never happened before. It just doesn't happen.
And
Turning
even young
up
people,
yeah, turning up. And like, and we're still saying, oh, well, that's probably as a result of COVID rather than the vaccine. Nonsense. I mean, there was no problems until the vaccine started to come out. Yeah, it has to be scientifically absolutely proven, but it's like in terms of reasonable doubt, we're way beyond that. It's quite clear that this stuff, I mean, AstraZeneca is taken off the market because it's producing clots, big long yolks, 6, you know, 4, 5, 6 inches long inside in people's arteries. I mean, you know, undertakers have been coming out saying this, but still we're going around, we're busy in our lives, you know, it's just all noise. 1 minute we're on this, the next minute we're looking at the Eurovision Song Contest, and then we're thinking about sports or whatever it is, you know, or you know, what other influencer rock stars out there is after saying something that's, you know, interest from a gossip point of view. I mean, they're relying on all that kind of confusion in our heads and actually seeing what's in front of us. We were all 5.5 billion of us collectively abused by our own leaders. That's the truth of it. The next question is, what are we going to do about it? That's the next big question.
And I think because even in the household, one would get the jab, the other wouldn't. Friends were falling out with each other. But I think because now you've got all these people that are putting the information out, so it's no longer hidden. It's like plain in sight. They've got the science to prove it. And I think it's the individual, the ego's getting in the way. Because if I'm wrong with something, I can put up my hand and go, that was my belief system based on this. But I have learned and I have seen that those that just kept attacking people, now they're just silent, but they're never putting their hand. And I think people have to actually realize we're not going to attack them for having now changed their mind. We'd actually appreciate if they'd done it, because if you can see the information, it wasn't your fault that you had that belief system, because even the way the algorithms work, you and me will see totally different things to everybody else because they keep pushing your belief system on these socials. So then you just keep assuming it's correct. But now that you get the information, I think people have to put up their hands, and the more people that put up their hands, the more people is there to fight them, and that's how it'll stop.
Yeah, it's tipping over. There's no doubt about that. But I mean, you've raised a very interesting psychological trap, right? And this question really is, how do we change our language to help people that are borderline waking up to wake up without driving them further into denial? Because it's, you know, because of cognitive dissonance. And, you know, people will admit anything other than the fact that they were fooled. But like, they have to understand that they were subject to an enormous, global, highly funded, extremely well thought out, military level psychological operation, and they were pounded at consistently for over 2 years by the leaders of their own society, nonstop. And that's what happened to them. And they have to begin to see themselves, I've been a victim here. I've been abused here by people that I trusted. And that's the big psychological challenge. But if they begin to see it as being, as they've been a victim of something, that they've been done, they've been conned, and they've been conned by the most sophisticated psychological operation ever launched in human history, because that's true. It's certainly the history we know about. That helps them, I think. I know I get into debates. I get into debates in the pub. Sometimes I get into debates in coffee shops. People come to me as well and say, instead of responding like that, maybe you should try this approach. And the psychologists that are doing that are coming to me with those pieces of advice. They're correct. We have to change the way we're engaging now to try and encourage more and more people to wake up out of it by using questions, putting questions to them, rather than pounding them with counterfacts, because it can drive them into their silos. But there'll be a certain proportion. Desmond would say 25% of the population can't change them. So as soon as you engage with one of those, you're wasting your time. Just walk away. They just it doesn't matter what information is out there. They just will not accept it, can't accept it, and will never change. They'll never come out of it. But like the great majority, 40 to 60% of the population are there for changing, and we have to pick them off one by one by one. By getting more and more, it's a multiplier effect by getting more and more people to understand these things and can raise the right questions and put the information across. But I think it has to be done, Roy, with great compassion, and understanding that we were all there at one stage. At some stage in our lives, we were all a victim of a belief system that was put into our heads using highly sophisticated propaganda. And therefore, we have to forgive ourselves for letting that happen. And that's all part of the healing process, isn't it?
Yeah,
And I
absolutely.
think we have to begin to see what's occurred over the last few years as a massive human trauma, and start applying the science and psychology around dealing with trauma recovery, because that's what we need.
Like, I mean, I know we can talk for hours and we can go
Yeah,
on this, so I'll definitely like it. But what I want to touch on before we kind of finish up is,
yeah,
like, I know you've mentioned it, like the climate change. I mean, we're
mm,
exposing that they were saying on Time magazine, global freezing globe and this global that. Then it became climate change. If you look at the people pushing it, I've had the guy that created Greenpeace on. We've exposed it. They're saying all the
yeah,
polar bears are dying. That's all a lie. Everything is a lie. They show one polar bear that's trotting
yeah,
across
yeah.
the starving
Yeah,
with
and the
his mom.
thermometers, yeah, the way we measure temperature as well is that's all being manipulated.
If like one thing that's scaring me, and it's like it's very few people are getting this, is they're spraying the skies. And I see it here. I'm in Poland. When I went back in Ireland last year, constant. And it's when you see it, you constantly see it. And under the Freedom of Information Act, somebody was asking about Wales and they directed them to the UK. And I've seen the documentation, and it's basically saying, yeah, we're doing it for climate change. They're spraying. But if you look at it, I saw all the, it's like they claim it's like dust blown in from the Middle East when you see kind of sand and the stuff. It's
Mm,
not, it's from the crap they're spraying. It's magnetic. I put a magnet, I done a video the other day, and it's sticking to it. That's going on our crops, that's going on our water, that's going in our lungs. They're poisoning us. But yet, when I put that out, people say, put back your tinfoil hat. And I'm seeing this all over the world. This is spread, like I have friends in Florida, in Holland, everywhere. They're doing it everywhere, and you can see it.
mm.
And I just like, is that something that you've covered yourself, or do you know
No, it's
much
not
about?
actually. I put my hands up and say I'm open to any further investigation, any channel, but I haven't looked at this in any great detail. I'm aware of it being a concern, but I've just exhausted myself on the kind of channels I've gone down. I know this is an area I need to look at, but I've no comment on it, Roy, because I'm not studied on it, and I careful about commenting on something that I haven't sort of immersed myself in.
Oh no, and I appreciate that. So, like, what I've seen is Rebel News did a very good recording in Dublin of the protest that was going on against asylum seekers and everything. So it's actually nice to see that there's media outlets that are coming in and doing that. But the guards were protecting the opposition or whatever way it was done. But I've seen a load, and it was like this is happening for years, but lately where the guards are beating the crap out of people. And I mean, in Ireland, like they call them dogs here, we call them pigs. When they do that, they do become the pig. There is genuine, it's some people that have taken the job to be a policeman to look after
Mm,
people, but they're beating the crap out of peaceful protesters. And this is an international thing as well. And it's really concerning when you see something like that. Those that are there to protect you are no longer protecting you; they're serving the masters.
Well, yeah, that's a the the, the 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 hard face of modern democracy is that it has the ultimate right to use violence legitimately. That's it can legitimately apply violence, and it's the only part of our society that can do it legitimately. The rest of it is criminal acts, and this is the real problem with the police force in any country, including the Gardaí in Ireland, is that they're under orders from from above to do this, and when they turn on a crowd at an event, whatever the event is, they're under an order to do that from an officer above them, who's under an order from somebody else. These things don't happen by accident. So there's a certain level of violence that they are instructed to apply, and they're following their orders. Now, I know a lot of members of the individual members of the Gardaí, and I hold them in very high regard. I think the Irish people hold the Gardaí in very high regard because most of the time they manage their affairs particularly well. But this has happened before. It happened over in the Corrib,
Yeah, I
the Corrib
remember that. Yeah.
protests, right? There was a huge amount of violence inflicted there as well, and we've seen breakouts of it occasionally here and there. But what's driving the Irish people demented is the fact that they are not being listened to by their own political establishment. We know we're not being listened to. We've been called far right, racist, and so on, to be deeply concerned about what's happening in rural small towns and villages that are getting massive inflows of these asylum seekers and the benefits that come with them. Meanwhile, when they raise their voice peacefully for a stay, they're being rounded on by their own media and by the state media, state broadcaster, and by the political establishment, and they're getting frustrated naturally. It's because they're not being listened to, and that's a powder keg situation, which I think will resolve very quickly on the 8th of June, when the European and local elections occur, because I think that the political establishment in Ireland is going to get absolutely hammered in those elections, such that it will spill over into an early general election, and that we will see a huge amount of new blood coming into the political system through new avenues, a lot of independence. We'll have to come up with a new way of governing the country if that happens. And that, because when the Irish get aroused, as the moment, we take it out in the polls, and that's where it happens. If it doesn't happen there, we're into a completely different situation. Then we're going to be into a confrontation between the Irish people and the establishment, and that will only end in one way, which is the end of the establishment. I mean, because if you get the Irish people going, people forget. People say, "Oh, you're very passive. You haven't done anything for years." Yeah, that's true. But just watch the space, because it's there. It's there in us, and it will come out if it has to come out. The dog has to come out. It will come out, but don't let it out. We're not at that point yet. Let's try and change this place, democratically and peacefully, which is our skill. Let's drive, because the other way is the other way is conflict and violence, and once that starts, it's very hard to switch it off.
How do we protect the voting? Because I mean, we saw the election fraud in the States, but I also saw with Brexit, you could see people changing the vote and everything. Is there any kind of traceability way that, because at the end of the day, if we look at it now, the political party, they're all the opposition, right? There's a handful of people that are really standing up and they're exposing everything. But like the reality is the ballot box should be transported with people from the different parties in it, and that it never disappears, because they can change it. And
They
like
can, yeah. Well,
yeah.
they can. I mean, you'll always get space for corruption. There's no doubt about that. And of course, the idea that an election system is entirely free of corruption anywhere in the world is nonsense. I mean, because there's so much power, there's so much money at stake that, you know, evildoers will intervene. The problem they have though is that where they're powerful, where that happens with, where the motive to do that is at its highest, is when there's very fine margins between one side and the other that could swing 1 or 2% one way or the other. But we're not at that point. I think this is like based on the vote of the 8th of March. There's going to be an absolute hammer blow coming in through the votes, and if they can float around with a few boxes here and there, it's not going to change the outcome, and they mightn't even bother trying once they feel it in the wind. If there are people there motivated to do that, and then we have to rely on ordinary individual people within the system prepared to call it out if they see it, and that should happen. Beyond that, I can't comment because I don't know. I don't know. I know of stories around these things happening. Again, very hard to verify any of that unless you can record it on your mobile phone, or somebody comes forward with with a signed affidavit prepared to blow the whistle on the whole lot of them if that's what they're attempting to do. But I actually think that the main political parties, Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, and the Greens, are going to get an awful pasting, and I think Sinn Féin, the main political party, will be just as badly pasted, if not worse, in worse condition at the end of the local and European elections. And remember, if people come through, just surge through on the locals, and if it's right across the board, the government may have no other choice but to call an early general election because they'll have lost the support of the people. And if that happens, those that have surged through in the local elections will almost be guaranteed to get into the Dáil. They'll just go literally a few months in the locals, and they're straight into Dáil Éireann, and we now have a new chamber with new thinkers, new blood. With the good and the bad, accept all that, but at least not compromised as being in a leadership position to inflict such harm on the Irish people over a period of a number of years.
It was it 20% or 25% was the actual turnout for the election?
No, it was higher than that. I don't have the number in my head. No,
But like, because if you look at the turnout versus the yes to no, it was looking like less than 10% would have been supporting all the political parties together, and they'll always get their cronies out. So it just shows how bad it is, because
it was a huge kick in the face. And what I found stunning about that was that anybody who's looking at this on the ground could see it coming. I mean, I was tweeting it, said this is the way it's going to turn out, even though even the bookies were getting it wrong, the scale of the swing wrong, but the political establishment and the commentariat were completely wrong. They were pushing and pushing and pushing for a yes. That's virtue signaling stuff. A lot of them thought they were probably doing the right thing, but there were other forces behind all of that were encouraging this. The question I'd be asking is, where did this come from? Who originated the idea that the Irish people needed to change the definition of marriage in the Irish Constitution? Where did that come from? Who funded it? Who were the leaders? Who did they convince? How did they do it? Who took up the running? Because this didn't come from the Irish people. There's no doubt about that. It did not come from the Irish people. This came externally, and through the stakeholder capitalism door, down through into the NGOs and into the bubble then around the government. That's where it came from. Same with the hate speech law.
If you look, because the margin was so big, it wouldn't be like the Lisbon Treaty where we voted wrong and we had to vote again. I mean, the fact that actually happened, that just shows how democracy doesn't work, because the people voted and then it was the wrong answer. Like that, when you look at that, and I mean, I don't know, have you actually gone into that? But there was one of the guys, he's from Limerick, I forget his name, but he was showing how they vote inside in the EU. There's a person goes with them. It's all closed. They're not allowed to bring their camera in. And it's like a secret society, and you can just kind of make your own notes, but you can't write it down as it is. And that's how the stuff has been voted on in the EU. So that in itself is showing how corrupt that is immediately.
Well, it's certainly, yeah. Look, listen, it could be very, very corrupt, subject to getting the evidence of it. But I mean, the fact that it's not open and transparent would be a great cause of concern. I have to say again, a bit like your question on on cloud formation. I actually don't know. I'm not.
It's actually Ming Lu or something, Luke Ming or something like
Yeah,
that. He
Ming
recorded it,
Flanagan.
so it's a YouTube video that was done.
Okay.
So I'll try to dig it out and
Yeah.
yeah,
Ming Flanagan. He's up for
yeah,
election
Ming.
again. Ming,
Yeah.
yeah.
So no, listen, Eddie, thoroughly enjoy it. Just curious because I have read your books before. You've a way with words, and like after listening to your speech in Cork online, I just thought it's fantastic because you're actually getting the people behind. You're doing what a lot of us have been trying to do for years, and it's
Yeah.
fantastic. You're getting moment. Have you any plans to actually write a book to get some of this
Yeah.
information out?
Yeah. Well, a number of things. Firstly, because people say like, what's the agenda here? What's in it for you? It's just nothing. I just say, look, I'm a dog. I have to bark. If you ask me not to bark, I get very depressed. I can't do it. I have to get back up and bark again. That's just who I am. So I'm barking again, because I've joined the dots. I join the dots and tell the arc of the story with trying to engage people in a way that they find the getting of the information easier. They don't feel they're being lectured to. That there's a dialogue going on, and there's a bit of humor as well, and so on. And then I stay around for hours afterwards talking to whoever wants to talk to me. So what we're going to be repeating it in a number of venues. That's planned. When we know what venues and what dates, obviously, we'll get the information out to the people throughout the social media channels that are open to us. Obviously, none of these meetings are ever going to be publicized or commented upon by the mainstream media. They'll just ignore them like they did in Cork. And after the event, I mean, the fact that nearly 1,000 people turned out at the venue and there was 100 cars turned away, and it was in the convention centre of Silver Springs, you would have thought that the local newspaper might have picked that up as something curious is after happening here. Let's cover it. Not at all. Not at all. And so we'll be doing that, and we'll be doing some more videos as well. I think clips and stuff from it. Trying to, because people like we've been talking here now for over an hour. But a lot of people, find it hard to engage with a discussion for such a long period of time. So I'm looking at trying to bring stuff down into small little clips, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, maybe putting things across as questions to people. I'm looking at that at the moment to see what could we do there just to help drive it further. And then being active on TikTok and social media. But we're encouraging everybody who comes along to these meetings just to take the stuff that we've got and replicate it themselves. We set up a website called 1215, which is the year of the Magna Carta, when feudalism was broken, 1215tribes.com. And on 1215tribes.com, then I'm putting up important documents like the Crotty ruling from 1987, which should be forced upon the Irish government to force them to create a referendum about the WHO. I think that's going to become important as events move on. And then links to important books like Kennedy's books, Dr. Judith Curry's books, Matthias Desmet on mass formation. In other words, the source material that I've been using in the videos are all up there, and I intend then to continue to do important video interviews myself on my YouTube channel Counterpoint with people that are kind of right fresh with new information about all of this, so that we can build up more and more energy around it. And but you're right. I mean, the problem with the X, and we can engage in echo chambers. You have to break out of the echo chamber and try to get out, get out into the wider field, and that's tricky when the mainstream media are trying to stop you, and the platforms are the algos and the platforms are still trying to stop you. You're suppressing. So you have to be careful about using the wrong words, especially in the taglines you might use for little clips here and there, and to try and come at it indirectly. So, for example, my video interview Counterpoint with Professor Judith Curry, I couldn't. As soon as I put up climate change, it got suppressed. So I just changed it. So the name of it is called uh, Saint Greta of Thunberg Busted, and it went flying through because the algos don't have a sense of irony.
Yeah, that's why we started saying the poison dart. They didn't know what we were on about. Yet everybody did. So
Yeah. At one stage I did a TikTok and I had to change it. I changed the words of the World Health Organization to using Gaelic. as Gaeilge. And that went flying through, but the other one was suppressed because, somebody said something about the World Health Organization, shut it down, refer it to the fact checkers,
Yeah, no,
the
brilliant.
funded fact checkers.
Exactly. And if you start looking at them writers and who's connected to who and Snoops and everything, it's all part of the game. Like, but listen, Eddie, thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. I'll make sure I'll put all your links on the audio and the video, the website, and everything that you've just mentioned there. But I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Roy, and best of luck to all of us as we wander through this minefield into the future.
So that's all for the Awakening Podcast. You'll find all our episodes on awakeningpodcast.org. Be sure to give us a thumbs up, 5-star rating, share with your friends, and comment on everything we said. Once it's not abusive, it stays up. Until next week, take care. So I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. As mentioned at the start, you'll find my 6 podcasts on bio.link/podcaster. And also, if you'd like to start a podcast or do a podcasting tour, you'll find the information on that or on the QR code that's there. Be sure to give us a thumbs up, 5-star rating, and share with your friends because it really helps. And also, I'd like to thank DanielPackard.com, helping people with fear, doubt, and anxiety. He's got a 90% success rate, and he's only charging if he helps you. So be sure to check him out, and you get a free call to discuss everything. Until next week, take care.